Surely we can do better. And I've laid out some steps that would allow us to do that, beginning with expanding Medicaid, introducing Medicare as an option on the exchanges, and then describing the goal that we want to get to, and ensuring that Republicans and Democrats alike come to the table to work on that.
Congressman, that is your time. Senator Cruz, there's a lot of concern in Texas and all over the country about President Trump increasing the tariffs. Toyota says Tundra trucks produced right here in San Antonio will increase in cost by $3,000 next year because of rising tariffs on auto parts. 2 nights ago on 60 Minutes, President Trump did not rule out increasing tariffs again. So the question is, do you believe tariffs threaten Texas growth? And if so, is it time for the Senate to step in and stop it?
I'm against tariffs. I'm against a trade war.
Is it time for the Senate to step in and stop it?
Let me answer the question. I'm against tariffs. I'm against a trade war. I have made the case repeatedly to President Trump that in trade, we should be expanding our access to foreign markets. We should be expanding the ability of Texas farmers and ranchers and manufacturers and energy to export our goods and services. If we are reducing the barriers, whether it is to Mexico or Canada or China or anywhere else, so we're selling more, that's a good thing. If we're erecting barriers and shutting down trade, that is a bad thing. This is one of the few issues on which Congressman O'Rourke and I have some common ground, in that we've both spoken out in favor of trade. The difference is that I'm able to work with President Trump and make the case to President Trump, and we have seen, for example, the President has negotiated a new NAFTA, a new trade deal that has benefits that should benefit the state of Texas, that should benefit San Antonio. Congressman O'Rourke is not able to work with President Trump, and indeed, Congressman O'Rourke is the only Democratic Senate nominee in the country who has explicitly come out for impeaching President Trump. That is extreme, and it means if Congressman O'Rourke has his way, he mentioned a shutdown.